Hi all, thank you so much for attending WIFIA's eligibility webinar. We're excited to talk about this topic and give you more detail on our eligibilities. Next slide, please. So just some logistics. If you are having any issues coming onto the webinar via Teams, there's the call-in number for you. We welcome any clarifying questions. Please keep yourself muted. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them at the end of the webinar. Please just use the chat function in Teams to ask a question. And any questions that we don't get to at the end of the webinar, we'll follow up with you through email. Next slide. So this is our agenda for the webinar. We're going to give a quick overview of the WIFIA program if you're not familiar. And then Karen Fligger, our senior program manager, is going to go over project type eligibility. And Jordan Dorfman, our senior attorney advisor, is going to go over federal asset screening. And then we're going to have a question and answer session. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to give the overview.
Thank you, Ariel. As Ariel just mentioned, we're going to have a quick background of the WIFIA program. We created this mission statement in the first years of the program before we ever made a loan, and it has served us well and continues to accurately state WIFIA's mission. Our mission is to accelerate investment in our nation's water and wastewater infrastructure by providing long-term, low-cost, supplemental credit assistance under customized terms to creditworthy water and wastewater projects of national and regional significance. The terms in our mission statement were selected for a reason, with each term representing a core program component. Though it's short, it succinctly describes the purpose and goals of WIFIA. Next slide. Our program was established in 2014 in the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, or WRDA. It was modeled after a similar successful program at the Department of Transportation called TIFIA. Between 2014 and late 2016, EPA took the necessary steps to establish a federal credit program at the agency and develop the administrative framework to make loans. In December 2016, Congress appropriated $25 million for credit subsidy for FY 2017, which allowed EPA to open its first selection round from January to April 2017 and select its first 12 projects for about $2 billion in project costs, to invite to apply for loans in July 2017. Since then, WIFIA has invited 144 projects amounting to over $18 billion in financing. EPA has closed 44 loans totaling $8.3 billion in financing. Next slide. In addition, these loans have created approximately 42,000 jobs and serve a population of 27 million. Next slide. One of Congress's directives when providing financing is that WIFIA select a geographically diverse set of projects. As you can see on this map, we have received letters of interest from projects in all but 8 states, though we did also receive letters of interest from Guam and the District of Columbia. As you can see, we have selected and closed loans across the country. Next slide. WIFIA is a federal credit program which allows it to leverage federal appropriations. Congress only needs to appropriate money to cover estimated losses, and the remainder of the funding is borrowed from and repaid to Treasury. Because the water industry has a low risk profile, the congressional appropriations can support a much larger amount of infrastructure investment. For example, EPA received $50 million in FY21. This amount will allow the agency to make approximately $5 billion in loans. And because WIFIA can only fund 49% of the project costs, the total infrastructure investment would total about $10 billion. Next slide. Some important features of WIFIA are: the total eligible project cost must be at least $20 million for large communities and at least $5 million for small communities, which are defined as communities of a population of 25,000 or less. WIFIA is a co-financer and can only fund up to 49% of eligible project costs. Repayment of loans can be up to 35 years from substantial completion of a project. Repayment can be deferred up to 5 years after the substantial completion of a project. The interest rate will be locked in at closing and be equal to or greater than the U.S. Treasury rate of a similar maturity. Projects must be creditworthy and meet federal cross-cutter requirements. Next slide. WIFIA has many financial benefits. It features a low interest rate. This is a single fixed rate that does not fluctuate depending on timing of disbursements. The rate is locked on the day of loan closing. We determine the rate by adding 1 basis point to the state and local government series daily rate with a maturity that is equal or greater than the weighted average life of the WIFIA loan. Using weighted average life means that the interest rate will be lower than the 30-year slugs rate in most cases. We have a highly flexible repayment schedule. We also may allow borrowers to preserve senior debt capacity. One flexibility with WIFIA is the loan may be subordinate to the project's senior debt obligations. The coverage ratio is calculated by dividing the senior payments by the system revenue, so WIFIA taking a subordinate position allows the coverage ratio to be higher for senior bondholders. If there is a bankruptcy-related event, WIFIA would need to be equal to the senior loan. There's also flexibility to sculpt the repayment schedule. Repayment schedules may be sculpted to accommodate the projected cash flow from projected revenues, from project revenues and other sources. WIFIA can also backload repayments. Because $1 today is worth more than in the future, if borrowers can repay a WIFIA loan later, it will cost them less. We also provide the presence of low-cost, flexible WIFIA debt can improve the position and confidence of other lenders. This may help borrowers obtain other sources of funding at more favorable terms. Next slide. I will now talk briefly about the WIFIA application process. The WIFIA program divides the application process into 2 major areas. Project selection is the first step. It includes the announcement of funding, called a Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, prospective borrowers submitting a letter of interest in response to the NOFA, and EPA selecting and announcing projects that it would like to invite to submit an application. Project review, negotiation, and closing is the second step. This kicks off when the invited prospective borrower submits its application and concludes when the applicant and the EPA administrator sign the term sheet. Negotiation and closing includes developing the term sheet into a credit agreement and signing it at closing. In most situations, the term sheet and loan agreement negotiation occur concurrently. Next slide. The project selection stage is competitive. Typically, we have significantly more requests for loans than we have money available to loan. Therefore, we review each letter of interest to ensure the selected projects are eligible, creditworthy, technically feasible, and meet the strategic objectives outlined in the WIFIA statute, regulation, and Notice of Funding Availability. Next slide. EPA intends to loan to the projects that it invites to apply. We will provide written responses to both those invited to apply and those not selected. Those who are selected are the projects that EPA intends to finance. At this point, the prospective borrower has reasonable assurance that they will receive a WIFIA loan. We will meet with those selected within 30 days to introduce ourselves and go over the application process. Applications are due 365 days from the date of the notification letter. All selected projects will be publicly announced in a press release, with basic information posted on the EPA website. Entities who are not selected may request a debrief. We find these conversations to be very useful and would encourage you to participate if not selected. Next slide. After application submittal, each application review is tailored to reflect the complexity and risk of the proposed project. And next slide. And now Karen will review project type eligibility.
Thank you, Jordan. So I'm going to walk through the many types of projects that are eligible under our program. So one of the really great things about the WIFIA program is its broad eligibilities, both in terms of borrowers and project types. We can lend to both public and private entities, so including municipal, tribal, state governments, and state revolving fund programs, and partnerships, trusts, corporations, and joint ventures for a wide array of projects. One thing to note for private borrowers is they must demonstrate support from the municipality where the proposed project will be located. The statute specifically outlines the eligible projects that are listed on this slide. Over the course of the presentation, I'm going to walk through each of these in detail and talk about projects that exemplify the specific eligibilities. So on the slides that are coming up, for each eligibility, the statutory language is in turquoise blue at the top, and then I'll describe it in more plain language and give you examples. As I walk through the eligibilities, I'm sure you'll start to notice that some of the eligibilities overlap. So it's definitely possible and probably likely that a project that you're considering would be eligible under more than one of the eligibilities. So the first eligibility is that if it's eligible for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, it's also eligible for WIFIA. And one addition to that is that the Clean Water State Revolving Fund eligibility does limit some of the projects to only being publicly owned. But the WIFIA statute expands that eligibility to allow for privately owned treatment works to be eligible as well. So the Clean Water SRF can really fund a wide range of water infrastructure projects, and they group them into 11 main areas. So there are a lot of traditional pipe and plant projects, like construction of a wastewater treatment facility, and all of the associated pipes that go with that. But in addition, the Clean Water SRF is able to fund non-point source pollution control projects, national estuary program projects, decentralized wastewater treatment, stormwater, both gray and green infrastructure, water conservation, watershed pilot projects, energy efficiency, water reuse, security measures, and technical assistance. So any of those projects that are eligible for the Clean Water SRF, and that's at the national level. So sometimes states are a little more restrictive, but this is anything that's eligible under the national program is eligible for WIFIA. And the SRF program, the Clean Water SRF program has a great guide on their website. So I included that link here to get more information about each of these 11 items that are on the slide. So a good example of a project that is eligible for WIFIA because it is eligible for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is the Coachella Valley Water District. We made a loan to them for $59 million. And it's a project to make stormwater channel improvements to increase the capacity to convey stormwater. And so this is a project that is both SRF eligible and WIFIA eligible. Similar to the Clean Water SRF, the Drinking Water SRF projects are, if it's eligible for the Drinking Water SRF, it's also eligible for WIFIA. So some specific things about Drinking Water SRF eligibility that also apply for WIFIA is that the borrower must be a public water system. So a public water system provides water for human consumption through pipes or other construction conveyances to at least 15 service connections and serves an average of at least 25 people for at least 60 days a year. And a public water system can be publicly or privately owned. So that's the specific definition for a public water system. And that's something that we check to make sure that the prospective borrower is a public water system, or that it's able to become one prior to closing the WIFIA loan. Another kind of unique piece of the drinking water SRF eligibility is that the project cannot be exclusively for growth. So there can be some reasonable growth for the existing population within a project that is for a drinking water project that is to address public health or regulatory compliance issues, but it can't just be for growth. So the drinking water SRF can fund drinking water infrastructure projects in 8 main areas. So the main areas are treatment, transmission and distribution, source, storage, consolidation, creation of new systems, water security projects, and energy efficiency projects. And similar to the clean water SRF, the drinking water SRF has really good resources to help look at eligibility, and that link is on the slide. One specific thing to note about the drinking water SRF eligibilities is per their regulation, they cannot fund raw water dams or reservoirs without a deviation. So under this eligibility, raw water dams and reservoirs are not eligible. And later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about how some of these projects can be eligible for WIFIA loans under some specific WIFIA eligibilities. So, in January, EPA closed an $81 million loan with the city of Beaverton. And this is an example of a project that was to meet some reliability and resiliency needs in their water system, but also did include expansion to include some reasonable growth that's expected for this area. So our fourth eligibility is around energy efficiency projects. So energy efficiency projects at public water systems or publicly owned treatment works are eligible for WIFIA loans. This is an area where it overlaps with the previous 2 eligibilities that I spoke about. And a good example of this was from the 2020 selection round, so the round that we just announced selections for. We invited Inglewood, Colorado to apply for a WIFIA loan, which includes a combination of projects, including electrical and control system upgrades, which are designed to modernize the system and make it more energy efficient. So in addition to the repair, rehabilitation, and replacement already allowed under the clean water and drinking water SRF eligibilities, the WIFIA statute has its own eligibility for repair, rehabilitation, or replacement of a treatment works, community water system, or aging water distribution or waste collection facility, including a facility that serves a population or community on an Indian reservation. While this is largely duplicative of the SRF eligibilities, there is one notable exception that we want to talk about. And this is the repair, rehabilitation, and replacement of raw water dams and reservoirs that are owned and managed by a community water system. So these would be eligible under the WIFIA program. And a community water system is defined as a public water system, so we talked about that earlier, that provides water to the same population year-round. So in 2020, we received a letter of interest that was for just that. So the Birmingham Water Works came in with a project and was selected to apply for a loan that includes the Lake Purdy Dam rehabilitation, as well as some other projects to improve the resiliency and supply dependability of the system. And because the Lake Purdy Dam is owned and managed by the Birmingham Water Works, this was considered an eligible project under WIFIA. Projects to provide an alternative water supply, such as desalination, managed aquifer recharge, water recycling, are eligible for WIFIA loans. For WIFIA, under this eligibility, the project does not have to be a publicly owned treatment work or a community water system. And in looking at this eligibility, there's sort of the last part which says, or a project to provide alternative water supplies to reduce aquifer depletion. So in that case, if that's the eligibility that your project is trying to come into WIFIA under, you would need to demonstrate that there is indeed aquifer depletion, and then how the project will provide an alternative. So in your letter of interest, you would need to provide studies, alternative analysis, engineering analysis, or other kind of documentation that really demonstrates the link to aquifer depletion and how your project would be a solution. An example of a project under this eligibility is in 2018, the WIFIA program closed a $614 million loan for the city of San Diego for its Pure Water San Diego water recycling project. So projects to prevent, reduce, or mitigate drought are WIFIA eligible. For WIFIA, for this WIFIA eligibility, the projects do not need to be owned by a public water system or publicly owned treatment work. And again, prospective borrowers need to demonstrate, not just state, how the location is impacted by drought and how the project would mitigate the effects of drought. So this is another place where in your letter of interest, you would really need to state the purpose of the project is to mitigate drought, and then provide some supporting documentation to demonstrate that. Some projects for construction or rehabilitation of dams and reservoirs may also be eligible under this eligibility if the connection to drought mitigation is demonstrated. So again, in the 2020 selection round, EPA selected the Lake Walford Dam replacement project submitted by the city of Escondido in California to apply for a $42 million WIFIA loan to construct a replacement dam with the purpose to mitigate drought. So the next eligibility is around property. So the acquisition of real property or an interest of real property is eligible under one of the following conditions. So it's either integral to the WIFIA eligible project, or it would mitigate the environmental impacts of infrastructure projects that are WIFIA eligible. And for this one, I don't have an example from our portfolio or from our pipeline, but it is eligible, and you can definitely come in for a project for this purpose. And the next two eligibilities, I'm going to start talking about combinations of projects. So the first one is a combination of projects submitted by the state SRF program. So as mentioned earlier, state infrastructure financing authorities, commonly known as SRF programs, are eligible WIFIA borrowers. An SRF program can combine SRF eligible projects into a single WIFIA loan. For 2020 and the upcoming 2021 selection rounds, the SRF programs could do that either under the traditional base WIFIA program or under a special program that had its separate appropriation that was exclusively for SRF program borrowers called SWIFIA. So SRF programs can do this to increase their lending capacity to communities in their state. And in 2019, the Indiana Finance Authority did just that. We closed a $436 million loan to finance 23 wastewater and drinking water projects across the state. Similarly to SRF borrowers, any eligible borrower can combine WIFIA eligible projects into a single loan as long as it's secured by a common security pledge. So we're often asked if drinking water and wastewater projects can be combined into a single loan. And the answer is it depends. So it really depends on the pledge. If there is a combined revenue pledge for water and wastewater projects, then there can be a single loan. However, if the borrower cannot combine the revenue for water and wastewater, usually because of local or state restrictions, then the projects cannot be combined into a single loan. And in that case, you would have to apply separately for wastewater and drinking water projects. In addition to having a common security pledge, the combined projects should share a common purpose, like improving the distribution system, replacing lead pipes, controlling combined sewer or sanitary overflows, or improving system resiliency. They should also have similar construction periods that are approximately 5 to 7 years long. So within the combination of projects for sort of not SRF borrowers, we generally talk about kind of two categories under this eligibility. So the first is a program of projects. And in a program of projects, the work is similar. So something like pipe rehabilitation and replacement. And it's happening throughout the service area. So in this case, the specific locations don't have to be defined before loan closing. And the construction timeframe is generally limited to 5 years. So it's either the longer of either 5 years post-closing or 5 years after the start of construction. So the other kind of category is combinations of projects. And this is where you have a variety of types of projects, all with a common purpose. But each of those projects have defined locations and defined scopes of work at loan closing. And again, you need to have a similar construction time frame. With the combination of projects, there's a little more flexibility to go a little bit longer. So construction is expected to be completed within 5 to 7 years of loan closing or the start of construction. So I'm going to give a couple examples under this one. So the first example is the combination of projects. So in 2018, the city of Baltimore closed a $202 million loan to finance 14 wastewater projects designed to eliminate sanitary sewer overflows. So the loan includes projects across the service area, including at treatment plants and in this collection system. But for this loan, Baltimore provided us with a list of projects prior to loan closing, and we knew exactly kind of the scope of those projects and the locations that they were going to be completed. So as an example of the program of projects, in the fall of 2020, DeKalb County, Georgia closed a $265 million loan with us for a program of rehabilitation work in its aging sewer system. So in this case, the work was very kind of similar rehabilitation work across the sewer system. But at the time of loan closing, they didn't know the exact locations or scopes of the projects because that part of the work was going to be to assess and prioritize where to do this work. So that was a program of projects. That's kind of what we would consider a program of projects for WIFIA. So I feel like I went through that very quick and it was a lot of information. But one of I think maybe the most important thing I want to leave you with is that at any time, the WIFIA program can review information about your project and determine if it's an eligible project type. So, you know, if you're thinking about WIFIA, even before you do your letter of interest, if you have any concerns about the eligibility of your project, we encourage you to reach out to us. And before you start going down the road of submitting a letter of interest. So a couple of things the request must be in writing, and it doesn't need to be long. I say 1 to 2 page project description and purpose. I think even 1 to 2 paragraphs might be enough, depending on the complexity of your project. And you can provide supporting documents. I think those are really important if you're looking to be eligible under drought and alternative water supply eligibilities, but may be relevant in other cases. Sometimes we're sent project descriptions or project fact sheets that are things that you already have created for other reasons, and that works too. So if you send in a written description of the project, someone on the WIFIA team can review, and we can give you a written eligibility determination even before you submit a letter of interest if you have concerns about eligibility. And during that time, we can also go back and forth if we have questions. We're also happy to meet with you, but ultimately any sort of project eligibility decisions are something we do only in writing. I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan for a couple more slides, and then we're going to move to the question and answer stage.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to go over something called federal asset screening. So a relatively new review required before project selection is a federal asset screening. This requirement stems from language in the FY20 WIFIA appropriation. EPA and the Office of Management and Budget were required to develop criteria to assess whether or not a project is considered federal in nature and therefore ineligible. The criteria were formally published in the Federal Register on June 30th, 2020, and can be found at 85 FR 39189. A link for that is provided on this slide and also on the WIFIA homepage. Every project for which a letter of interest is submitted will be evaluated using 2 screening questions and 16 criteria. Without going into depth about the criteria themselves, the 2 screening questions are important to note. They are as follows. Is the project, in whole or in part, a project currently authorized by Congress for the Army Corps of Engineers or Bureau of Reclamation to construct? And the second is the project, in whole or in part, a local cost share requirement for an Army Corps of Engineers or Bureau of Reclamation project? EPA provides detailed answers to these screening questions and submits them to OMB and the criteria as well. Based on these answers, OMB then notifies EPA whether or not the projects are eligible. For the most part, these criteria should not affect the vast majority of projects. If you have any concerns regarding these new criteria, we are happy to talk about them. Please note that this does not require anyone to provide anything additional to EPA during the application process. However, if necessary, we may ask clarifying questions. And that is all, and I think we can move on to questions and answers, or I'll just turn it back to Ariel.
Thanks, Jordan. So I've been following the question and answer in the chat. So thanks for putting those in there. The first question we received is how competitive is the process? So this process, I'll turn my video on. This process varies from year to year. It really depends how much money we have and how many letters of interest we receive. So with the exception of our first year of 2017, the last 3 rounds, we have been able to invite the majority of prospective borrowers to apply, or we've selected them. So I would say that we are still in a competitive environment, but if you look at our scoring criteria and our notice of funding availability, you get a pretty good idea of what we're looking for. So I think that's the answer to that one. We had a couple of questions about our scoring. And so and then a couple of questions about for 2021. So we do have our fiscal year 2021 appropriation. We have not yet released our notice of funding availability for 2021. We don't have a set time frame, but our expectation is that we will be releasing the notice of funding sometime this spring, and so the letter of interest would be due sometime this summer. So that is our expected time frame, but be sure to sign up for our mailing list, which is on the screen right now, the tiny URL link, if you're not already on the mailing list, to get notified when our next notice of funding comes out. So the next question is, can an entity have both SRF and a WIFIA loan? So I will just take that one because that is an easy one. So yes, definitely. Because as mentioned, we only fund up to 49% of project costs. We frequently pair with SRF. They can come in as the 51%. Just the only caveat to that is that we can only have up to 80% of federal costs. So we just have to work with the SRF to make sure that the federal funds are avoided. But other than that, there's no issue with working with SRF, and we've done it frequently with many loans. So the next question, if there's a local government and a water company that want to jointly apply, I think there was maybe a couple of words missing from the question. I think the question was, who would be making payments? Or how would that work? So maybe we can get some clarity on that one in the chat.
Well, we've certainly had projects so far that have been joint P3 projects between private businesses and local jurisdictions. We would generally prefer to see a single entity applying and a single entity making payment, but we can work with whatever types of borrowers come in.
Okay. Next question, is land acquisition an eligible activity as part of the water protection project?
Yeah, so I think under the SRF eligibilities, as long as land acquisition is eligible because it's clean water SRF eligible, as long as there's a tie to water quality.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Other than the eligibility for private water suppliers, what are the benefits for WIFIA over SRF or even USDA rural development funds? And then the second part, what benefit is there for the program that only funds 49% of the project costs?
We did have a slide earlier on that talked about some of the financial benefits of a WIFIA loan. Some of those benefits compared to SRF or rural development are the longer repayment terms, a lot of flexibility in how we handle repayments, so sculpted repayment terms, and the size of the loans that we can make. And even though it's only 49%, as was mentioned, we often are co-financing with SRF programs. A large amount of projects that we funded are very large and could not be funded entirely by SRF. That being said, if it's a small project in a small community, if we're talking a couple of thousand people or even in the hundreds, and that community can receive or is going to receive an SRF loan for the entire project, or a rural development loan or grant, certainly those would be better deals for the small community. We are available for those communities, but again, if they can receive cheaper money that covers the entire project, that would make more sense. Now, it was also mentioned that we're not competitive with the SRF. Someone did respond to that. We are very often competitive with the SRF, particularly in the interest rate environment we're in today. We often have lower interest rates than SRF programs. And we are certainly not just a facility for smaller or lower credit jurisdictions. If you look at our list of borrowers, they are often very large and very highly credited jurisdictions that are often AA or AAA rated.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. Next question, what are the long-term land management requirements for WIFIA?
Sure with that.
Yeah, no.
Referring to.
Yeah, so if we could get a little bit more information in terms of what you're looking for on that one. I'll skip that one for now. And apologies to everyone since we're doing this remotely. Where the questions are a little more logistically challenging for us. I will mention, so this was kind of along the lines of the SRF matching question before, but we received a question more general about our federal or state loan and or grant funds, can they be used to meet the 51%? So yes, again, it's the 80% cap that you kind of have to look out for as a potential issue. But generally, especially with SRF, that can be worked around. For other federal money, that's something that we have to keep in mind, the 80%. All right, so other question is, can we sit down on a call to discuss potential projects for 2021 and 2022? Yes, absolutely. We can take meetings anytime throughout the year that you want to discuss any projects. We're happy to do that, and we do that quite frequently. So if you just want to send an email to wifia@epa.gov, we can schedule a meeting anytime you want to discuss the project and if it would be a good fit for WIFIA and if you have any other questions. So we have questions about interest rates and terms that we've offered over the last year. I think that's a little bit hard without information in front of us, but I mean, I will say, given the interest rates were quite low in 2020, our interest rate, as Jordan discussed, is tied to the Treasury rate on the day of closing, and we use a weighted average life, and then we add a basis point. So we, off the top of my head, they've been in the 1% to 2% range for the past year, but it's very dependent on where we are with Treasury. And I will also mention that for some of our borrowers who had loans closed earlier in the program in 2018, when the interest rates were a bit higher, we have been offering interest rate reduction. So they've been able to come and re-execute their loans to take advantage of the low interest rates in 2020. So that's something that is newer to the program that we've started offering borrowers who were not in the premium interest rate environment that we were in 2020. For the terms, that really varies. I think that would probably be a longer conversation, but I mean, some of the terms that Jordan already mentioned in terms of our flexibility, we've taken advantage of all of those in our past loans. All right. So yeah, so one question, can WIFIA fund lead service line projects? Yes, we can. I don't know if you want to mention any caveats with that or any more information.
No, so I think WIFIA can fund lead service line replacement projects for public water systems and community water systems. I think that's it. Yeah, I think we would, encourage folks to come in. This is one of the places where like a program of projects might make sense. So you could look at what lead service lines you need to replace over the next 5 years and come in for that as a program.
Okay. And so we have a question about how do we make sure that the projects or borrowers comply with federal requirements such as AIS and Davis-Bacon? Yeah, we didn't go into that. In this webinar, we talk about that in lots of other places in our information. But yes, Jordan, do you wanna take that one?
I don't have a whole lot to say about it other than we do look at and ask to see contracts or bid documents that are going out prior to closing of loans to make sure that requirements are included. After closing of the loan, we will do occasional inspections to make sure compliance is being met. That's all I can really say on it, though.
Yes. So, okay. So I think I'm gonna end the Q&A. We just got asked if a link will be provided to this presentation. If you didn't receive it from yesterday from my email, then please just email wifia@epa.gov and I'll send you the presentation. The presentation, this webinar is also being recorded, so it will be on our website. And if you're interested in that, or any coworkers that want to see it, then I can send you that link as well. And I think that is about it. As I said, we are always open to meeting with anyone interested to speak with us about a project. And everyone have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for attending the webinar.